Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our panel on sustainability. We're here today celebrating Industrial Ethernet Week with HARTING and Beyond Design, talking about the intersection of sustainability and design. I'm Casey Spitz, responsible for development and innovation here in HARTING Americas.
Vivek, the head of the Innovation Hub in Cambridge.
Michael Prince, president of Beyond Design.
Noah Young, industrial designer at Beyond Design.
Thank you for those of you who are rejoining. We are here for the second part of our panel, and we'd like to start with a question from the audience from the first part. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion for us here. What are some of the practices your average consumer can implement to contribute to a more sustainable product life cycle? I'd like to start with Beyond Design, and then we'll switch it over to HARTING.
It really starts with the materials and separation of materials, so education. I honestly believe that if the youth were able to get the students and to understand what is a polypropylene material, what is an ABS material, how can we separate these materials to go back into the right stream so that they don't end up into landfills. So education is really where I would start with. Noah?
Yeah, I think there's numerous ways. One of them I would definitely say is just being a conscious consumer. Not only in the way of knowing who you're buying from, where the materials or where the product is at least coming from, you can't get that granular with it, but also just being conscious of, and this is controversial to say because we sell products, we try to get more products out there, but do you need a new toaster, or is your current toaster fine for a few more years? And not just buying without, taking, a thought about it, really stepping back to make sure that there's a need before you contribute more.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to build off of that because we see in the consumer space the expansion of fast fashion, right? Mm-hmm. So products that are meant to be used once. They talk a lot about clothing, but I'm curious if you see the same thing in physical product. Is there a fast fashion that's happening in the B2B space? And if so, how can we avoid it?
Fast fashion, it's an interesting term. From a product standpoint, we're trying to push our clients to longevity. Mm-hmm. If we could get the products to last longer, be made out of better materials, change the life cycle of the product, that's really what we're trying to push. To have customization, it's possible. It really depends upon the product that we're developing and the types of customization that they're looking for. So, for instance, in the fashion, just being able to change the fabrics is relatively easy. If we're going to be designing a toaster, we're going to need materials that are going to perform. So color finish materials are things that we can play with relatively easily to accommodate customers and changes with lifestyles as well as trends that are happening.
And on that fast fashion example, for us coming as designers, a reason why fast fashion becomes such a thing is because styles are changing constantly and speeding up. So everyone wants what's new immediately. So a way that we can, contribute to having a heritage product, a product with, increased longevity, is incorporating as timeless of designs or as customizable, adaptable designs as possible, so that it doesn't look dated immediately and it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, amongst your other beautiful products that you own.
Mm-hmm. And Vivek, maybe you can speak a little bit to this. I know that connectors may not be the most fashionable product, but can you talk about how industrial Ethernet can be used for future-proofing on, let's say, a production floor?
Yeah, so definitely in terms of the data, as we talked about, data in terms of energy consumption, in terms of quality, in terms of yield, in terms of uptime, but also from a connectivity perspective. I think one aspect which is often overlooked is really the requirements, design requirements. Because, so, for example, if we have a connector that could be used for any possible anticipated, end-use application, it has to go through a lot of testing, a lot of qualification. What if a customer were to say, what, I don't care about railway flammability or whether it's going to work in a aerospace environment. I'm just going to put it into this industrial application. I only need this IP rating, this power rating, so on and so forth. So, bespoke requirements can actually play a big role in sort of reducing, the overall cost it takes, both in terms of money as well as energy, to bring a new product, to market. So that, in combination with very effectively utilizing, process data across the enterprise, starting all the way at design, through production and into logistics and distribution, I think is a very key strategy. And here, industrial Ethernet is sort of the backbone, in being able to get all this data, process it effectively and leverage some of the edge to cloud AI strategies that we talked about previously.
What it comes back to me is what we always heard when we were children: reduce, reuse, recycle, right? And I know Lucas in his earlier presentations shared some of the terminology that's being used now, but those 3 R's have always stuck with me. So can you speak to how industrial Ethernet specifically can help with reduction? Are there technology changes that are reducing material needs, anything like that?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, for example, we talked about the example in production where if I were able to incorporate energy as a planning variable, so if this product is not needed immediately, do I necessarily need to produce that in the same batch? Okay, it may be more convenient to do that, but if I had energy as a variable in my production planning, I could maybe push that out a week here, pull that in a week here, and sort of optimize, the overall energy utilization, within the production plant. So that's one very clear example. I would say 80% of the cost and the energy impact and the embodied carbon is set at design time. And so that's why the design decisions we make are so critical, right up front, because there's only so much you can do after the fact, to try to recover and try to reduce that greenhouse gas footprint. So I think it's a combination between, the decisions we make at design time and then very effectively optimizing across these different, verticals, which are often, stovepiped or chimneyed, typically manufacturing and logistics. They may or may not talk to one another. I think now we have to, if we really want to be effective in reducing this overall, greenhouse gas emission footprint across the enterprise, we have to break down these silos. And here again, industrial Ethernet is a very critical tool to very rapidly exchange information, across many aspects of the enterprise.
Strongly agree.
So continuing on with the reduce, reuse, recycle trend, I'd like to talk a little bit about end of life of product. In some cases that's recycle, in some cases that's not. Noah, earlier you had raised a topic that many manufacturers may not think of the final end state of their product. What do we need to be doing on the education side, to Michael's point earlier, and how do we change that story going forward?
Yeah. So I mean, on the reduce, reuse, recycle, it kind of starts that as a basis. We think of those as like a triad, but it's really a hierarchy. So reduce is number one. That's your main goal when you're starting out, reducing, your emissions, your amount of material used. Reuse is, the secondary resort, and then recycle really should be the last resort. But we've turned to that to be our primary resort. So since we're dealing with that, though, a way that designers, I think, and what we've implemented is a way to make sure that you're designing for end of life is just opening those lines of communication like we were just talking about. You can visit your local, MRF facility. You can talk to the people that are actually disposing of your product. We live, in America. We have a unique situation. There's no, strict federal regulations when it comes to recycling, typically, special cases for specific products. But most of it is up to state or even city or local municipality. So really going, if you're a manufacturer, opening up that line of communication with your, disposer, talking to them directly, seeing what your city, what your town does and what those requirements are immediately. And, like I mentioned before, it's doing that at the very beginning of the product development.
We're talking with companies about how they can change their process. One particular one is about spray cans, and they use spray cans by the thousands on a daily basis. And so how do you properly dispose of them? And so we're always looking at new ways of changing the can or changing that whole process. But in the end, it might not be the solution to change the product, but it's really about how to bring the product back to properly dispose of it. And that comes back to whose responsibility is it? Is it the end users? Is it the company? Or is it going to be the manufacturer? And those discussions are happening. It does come down to cost. But ultimately, I think with government pressure, it's coming back and being put more on the companies themselves and the manufacturers. You see a lot of that happening in Europe, and so the trends that happen in Europe tend to come into the U.S. probably. I mean, it's slow. It's probably like 5 to 10 years that it takes, but it's happening, and people are really starting to consider it. And I would say our customers, they are considering options. They're just moving very slowly at it.
So speaking on that trend, are there specific opportunities that you see for manufacturers to help customers hit their ESG goals? Should we be following the trends of Europe? Are there unique opportunities that are happening here in the States?
Hmm. We work in the HVAC market quite a bit, and in a case like that, the government is really pushing the manufacturers, which is then pushing the consumers for change in the industry, and this is all to better the environment. So um, I think that it's the responsibility of the manufacturers to start opening up and educating. I keep talking about education, but that's what opens up the channels of communication, which is what NOAA's really pushing. And so if the manufacturers could let the consumers understand why the changes have to happen, there'll be more acceptance. I think it will happen faster, which is what needs to happen.
Perfect. Noah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, well, trying to think of how to word it without just repeating what Michael said. Like maybe you have something to add to that?
Well, I mean, let me just change the discussion topic just a little bit and address some of the issues of manufacturing itself. And when we look at, typically today, when you look at manufacturing, especially in high volume production, we're basically optimizing for cost and delivery, right? But you had referenced 3D printing, other technologies which are more localized, produce on demand, on site, where you need it, when you need it. And by actually doing that, you do tend to eliminate a lot of the energy costs associated with transportation, shipping, inventory. But that also requires a mindset change, that you have to look at the total cost of ownership, not just, I want absolutely the cheapest price up front, but what is my life cycle cost? And cost not just in dollars, but in kilograms of CO2. And when you look at that, all of a sudden 3D printing is not necessarily just a prototyping or a low volume production process. It may end up being actually a viable production process when you look at the total life cycle cost. And so I think part of the challenge, especially in the B2B industrial environment, is getting away from this mindset that everything is purely driven only by dollars. There's another variable out there called kilograms of CO2. And when we try to optimize for both of these, I think we could definitely embrace different manufacturing methods that are more localized, in the region for the region, lower emissions overall, eliminating this complex web of logistics. And quite frankly, that's even more robust and more resilient, because as we saw, unfortunately in the pandemic, there was sort of a massive breakdown of global and massive disruption of global supply chains. And so I think a lot of people, a lot of companies are now embracing the concept of localization and sort of this not redundancy, but robustness and resilience in the supply chain. So I think, just, to change the discussion a little bit, some of the ways in which we manufacture things right now, need to be rethought. And that can definitely contribute, I think, to ESG goals, although it could have an impact on incremental cost. We need to look at the overall cost over the entire enterprise.
And to build off of what you're saying, we feel that very strongly here. In the building that we're sitting in today, we have on-site manufacturing. So to have manufacturing in the Americas in Chicagoland is not something that was really happening 7-10 years ago. It was much more of a just-in-time model coming from low-cost manufacturing locations. So in addition to localizing, we're seeing the reduction in CO2 emissions from shipping. We're also seeing higher customer service levels because of the reduction in shipping time. Can you expand upon that and how it's sustaining or contributing to sustainability goals?
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I think there's been this myth of low-cost production, because the fact of the matter is we basically pushed the problems to another part of the world where someone else had to deal with it. And the fact of the matter is, that whole thing of low-cost production, they have more relaxed environmental standards. No, that's wrong. China, India, other parts of the world, they're realizing that, hey, we're not the dumping grounds for Western countries. They're actually leading in a lot of ways. When you look at renewable energy, China's definitely putting in massive investments in that regard. And so I think this entire myth of constantly chasing low-cost production around the world is going to end, and that's a good thing, by the way, because now that forces us to consider all these systems level problems that we previously just tried to push off, and I'm talking across industries. This is not, within connectors or industrial products. It's basically all industries. And so I think when you think about it that way, again, this sort of total, life cycle approach really forces you to reconsider, a lot of things about where you're sourcing materials, how you're producing them, and at what scale and what level you're producing them. And I'm very excited, that the industrial Ethernet, implementations here are also going to, I think, assist in that transformation and rethinking of not just manufacturing, but how we really conduct business, globally.
So I think that Americans have been conditioned to low-cost, disposable. I'll buy a toaster. I expect it to work for a couple of years. I'm going to move. I'm going to throw it away. I'm not going to take it with me. And I'll just buy a new one because it's low cost. And as prices start to go up because costs are just generally going on materials and labor, et cetera, if we as designers can start to design them so they can be fixed or they can be reused in a certain way so that the longevity doubles or triples and people are going to hold on to those products longer, that's an area that we as designers would like to get to. But a lot of it's changing the mindset of Americans. The Walmarts of America, you go in, you expect the lowest price, but you don't expect it to last very long. Change that to where I expect to pay a little bit more, but it's going to last a lot longer. And we see a lot of those trends happening, from Europe, where parts that were typically plastic, maybe they're going to be a die-cast metal. And because of that, it's going to last longer. And because of that, it's going to be quieter. But yes, it's going to be more expensive. So that mindset, as we can change that in American and in the world, that price is not the leading factor in a decision that you're going to make to buy that product.
Yeah.
If there are any toaster manufacturers online, we love your product. Love to put industrial Ethernet on them. Call me afterwards.
But that's actually a good point, though. It's like, how much energy is that toaster really using? And are there ways that I could be more educated and conscious of how I'm using that appliance? It's kind of like brushing your teeth with water. A lot of people will turn the water on, and just while they're brushing their teeth, they'll let that water run. I actually saw in one of the toothpaste, they have a thing really suggesting to shut the water off when you're brushing your teeth. Now, this is a toothpaste company trying to promote that to better the environment. So it goes back to that education that I keep talking about.
Well, not to keep harping on the toaster example, but it is an interesting aspect of a lot of people might, you have an old toaster, it's clearly not as efficient as a brand new toaster. You're using more energy per use of that toaster, but that still might not equal the amount of, your carbon footprint of buying a brand new, super efficient toaster that brand new one did before it even hit the shelves. So you keeping that older, less efficient one, it doesn't feel as good. It doesn't make, it uses a little bit more power. But if you are trying purely to reduce your carbon footprint, it might still be the more sustainable option. It's, it's just kind of shifting your thinking.
Absolutely. And I know for many of those that are on the line, you might be working for companies that make, as an example, injection molding machines. This is very much in the supply chain and the process chain of a toaster. So it's about making high quality products that don't need to be disposed of. That's going back to reduce, reuse, recycle. That's the reduce. Absolutely. And that might be even more important to your point than how do you dispose of it at the end of its life. If we can bring up the graphic again, we keep coming back to this life cycle management aspect of it. So we've talked about the early prototyping, we talked about digital twin, we've talked about the disposal at the end, we've talked about IoT in the middle. But what we haven't talked about is how to look at supply chain through this entire life cycle management. What I'm hearing you guys saying as our expert panelists is these can't be done in isolation anymore. So for the Beyond Design team, I'd love to hear if you could share your perspective. Has your customers' views on how they design with supply chain in mind changed over the time that you guys have been in business?
Yes. I'm a little bit older, so I can recall back in the 80s. But in the 80s and 90s, a lot of manufacturing was going overseas to China. Why? Because of low-cost labor. But I think a lot of it was the fact that they were able to get around policies in the US that were to protect the environment. And so we just kind of shifted it over there. Wasn't the right thing to do, but again, going back, Americans wanting a lower cost, that was what happened. The mindset now changing. I think that Manufacturing is starting to go a lot to Mexico, which is actually really good because it's closer. So from an emission standpoint, there's a lot less travel. From a timing standpoint, it's a lot better. So as designers, we're really hopeful, encouraged, and excited about that opportunity. The closer we are to the manufacturers, the more we can talk and really figure out ways to improve the design, reduce or change the materials, and keep going forward into quality control.
Perfect, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about some of the trends that are facing designers, but one trend that we feel very strongly at Harting is miniaturization. And I know we've seen a shift recently where miniaturization has come from our customers as a way to make their products smaller, but now we're actually seeing the connection with sustainability. So a miniaturized control cabinet requires less metal. Vivek, can you speak a little bit to this trend where miniaturization is helping people meet their ESG goals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very vital trend. And so again, let's pick on the data center market where we're seeing a need for greater and greater power at the rack level. So for example, going from maybe 33 kilowatts at the rack level all the way to 100 kilowatt at the rack level. But you don't necessarily want to increase the size of the connections. And so that puts a really big onus on looking at, for example, high energy density. But let's think about the implications of that. If we could save even 2% of all the energy that's flowing through a connector going into a rack level, based on 2020, data center power consumption, 2%, just looking at 2% of the US data center market, if we could save that energy by having a more efficient, high energy density miniaturized connector, that would have saved 950 million kilowatt hours. So even a very small change can move the needle dramatically. And so we're seeing this across the board in power, in signal, in data. You're right. There's an increasing need for wanting to miniaturize, combine different functionalities, and really sort of shrink the footprint, the physical footprint, but also enable these devices in some cases to become intelligent, active, aware. And that's where the industrial Ethernet piece really is important, because it's not just about how the device is functioning, it's about the data and the information I can get out of the device. And so I personally think it's actually a very exciting time in connectivity, because we're sort of enabling a lot of our customers to reach their goals in terms of miniaturization, higher energy density, higher information density. These two things go together. And so, I think the industrial Ethernet is right there, in the mix.
Absolutely. And we're seeing similar trends happening in the rail space as well, where previously weight reductions were considered a cost optimizer. We're now seeing the strong connection between reductions in weight to sustainability goals. Single pair Ethernet is a big contributor to that weight reduction. Could you briefly explain single pair Ethernet for our audience and how it contributes to that weight reduction?
Yeah, sure. So, single pair Ethernet, as the term implies, is a single pair of wires that's able to very effectively get data at large distances. And I think that's one of the key things. Large distances, simple, lighter weight cables, lighter weight connectors, and even reducing 1 kilogram of mass off of a locomotive, off of a rail car, really has a big impact over its 30-year life cycle when you think about the fuel savings that can result in. So there's a constant need, I think, for again, the higher energy density, the higher more information communication, but at a lighter weight, and a smaller form factor. And single pair Ethernet, I think, definitely enables that miniaturization, the ability to basically get digital data over much longer distances than conventional Ethernet technology would do.
That's perfect. Thank you. From the Beyond Design team, are you seeing similar requests for weight reduction in designs as a way to reduce material?
Especially products that are coming from overseas. They're trying to fit more products onto the boats, therefore they're going to lower their cost. So a lot of times customers will come to us and they'll start out with what their maximum height is, width and depth for that container that they're going to be designing for shipping the product over. So that starts with our requirements. As far as the overall products, we look a lot about the ergonomics and how someone's going to actually interface with it, how they're going to touch it, in a cable, how they're going to actually install it, how they're going to release it. So we try to make it as small as possible, but again, we're looking at to make sure that the ergonomics are going to be proper and we don't lose sight of that.
I know that's something that you specialize in your design firm is the ergonomics. So if ergonomics is always king, are you starting to see sustainability creep up on the priority list?
Do you have an answer?
I mean, sustainability is definitely up there, and it can, when you're trying to reduce the amount of material as much as possible on something that's, like, let's say you're doing something that has a handle on it. You don't want to make that, you could probably make that handle like a 1/4 inch thick. You don't want to do that because it doesn't feel great in your hand. So then that comes to the internal design of the unit. So you still have a nicely designed ergonomic exterior housing, but then on the internal engineering of the various ribs and bosses and reducing as much material internally that the consumer does not feel or see is where you can make a difference there.
And that's a good point. And you were mentioning that earlier, that sometimes the requirements that clients will put onto a particular project are so high and so unobtainable that the cost just drives higher and higher and higher. But if you're able to really look at what those requirements should be, then you have a better chance of getting a lower cost and meeting them. And I think that understanding is what's important at the beginning of the process. So for instance, if we're designing, an e-charger, let's say, that wall thickness, are we going to use 0.1 inch? Are we going to use 0.08, 0.07, 0.06? And it comes down to the requirement, which is the drop test. And who determines the drop test? Whether it's an industry or whether it's a company, those are the things that we're trying to design to meet. And we have to challenge, are those the right specs? And that's a way that we can reduce all the emissions.
Are you feeling these pressure on both consumer products and business-to-business products, or one more than the other?
Probably more on the B2B side,
Okay.
even though it should be the opposite. It's just on the consumer side, it's price, price, price,
Yes.
speed to market. And between those two, usually the last one being the recycling becomes least important. But I would say though, on the packaging side, on consumer, it's changing a lot because of Amazon, right? So when you would go into a retail store, let's call it a CVS store, they would have big plastic that you needed a knife or scissors to cut into to be able to get the product out. It was tamper-proof. Well, the retailers were asking for that kind of packaging to prevent theft. Well, now all of a sudden you've got Amazon, so you don't have that problem. Therefore, the packaging doesn't need to be this big piece of plastic. Therefore, there's a real need to reduce the packaging in a case like that because the needs of that packaging change. And so as designers, we understand that and we're pushing our clients to really understand that as well, that the retailers are no longer have good reasons for packaging that's not really appropriate for the environment.
So it sounds like in both cases, EV chargers and more consumer products, we're seeing major disruptors coming in and changing the market. Tesla's changing the market for EV chargers, setting expectation. Amazon's changing it for packaging. Any guesses what the next big disruptor will be?
I'm really hoping it's around lithium-ion batteries.
Okay.
More and more products that we design that are consumer electronics have a lithium-ion battery built into it. You can't access it. So when we think about end of life, we're thinking about where is that battery going to reside? And some people say, well, it's really just a small battery. But when you start looking at the number of batteries, the number of products that are out there, I question where is it going? And whose responsibility is it to watch where it goes? And so we're trying to push harder and harder for our customers to think about that and to allow us to really dive in to see if there's a way to remove those bad parts easier, whether it be with screws as opposed to a sonic weld or snaps that can come apart. Again, that starts at the design process.
I definitely experienced that in my home with 3 young children. There's a lot of toys that have non-rechargeable batteries, and it can be a frustrating experience. And to your point about education earlier, very confusing what to do with that product once it's reached its end of life because you can't simply throw it away. Wonderful. So we have a great question coming in from the audience. I'll let you guys decide who wants to answer this one first. What is the most critical path forward for manufacturers and designers on their journey to sustainability and helping their customers meet the ESG goals? So what do we need to be doing right now with importance?
Mm, I come back to education. I hate to keep harping on it, but understanding what ESG is and all the aspects that you can improve your ratings, your level of emissions. Um, you just need to take every precautions to look at it carefully and break it down and say, can we do this better? And if you can do it better, make that push to have it happen. So, from our standpoint of design, we're trying to make things smaller. We're trying to get the wall thickness and the material to be lighter. And we're trying to educate the customers into those different materials. It's a hard push because we're just a consultant that can make recommendations. We're not the corporate leaders that can then demand that these changes take place. So we're kind of stepping on delicate waters or delicate glass, but we feel it's our responsibility and duty to make that education.
Yeah.
I was going to have a very similar answer to that because, as we were looking at that, the design to launch, I guess, graph the life cycle of a product, there's a lot of steps on there. And all those steps, they require their own expertise and they're all places to implement sustainable practices. That's a lot for any individual or even, individual companies to be experts in all of those aspects. So, especially for us coming as consultants, being kind of generalists and being able to speak the language, be able to talk with experts and have a conversation with people that know more than us so that we can pass that on to other people that know less than us. So it's not necessarily us having, all the hard data. We just know the thought process that you need to have in order to make those changes.
Mm-hmm. And if I can throw my project manager hat on for a second, what I would say is, based on Lucas's presentation this morning, if you take 2 years to design the most beautifully sustainable product and then you airship it from China, have you really hit your goals? So I think there's a big takeaway for all of us about proper planning can really help a lot. And as consumers, how do we make sure that our forecasts are coming in properly so that we can help reduce the carbon footprint of that product coming into our own plant? And that sounds like maybe even more impactful than making a recyclable product. Although I love the idea of mushroom-based packaging and all these other big trends that are coming out. We should talk to our supply chain friends about making sure the forecasts are in place.
I agree.
Yeah, one additional thought on that. In the industrial space, everyone has a customer, everyone has a supplier, right? And increasingly, we're seeing in our business, our customers are being very specific in their ESG goals, flowing down to their suppliers. And so, to address the question of, how does an engineer or designer get started, listen to what your customer is specifically asking for, because in a lot of cases, they're getting very granular in their requirements in terms of embodied carbon, in terms of ethical employment practices. Are you sourcing materials from conflict regions? I mean, it's very expansive. And, and again, I think this is a good thing because there's a shared responsibility between customer, producer, supplier. It's that entire ecosystem as well. And so at least in our business, we're getting very clear messages from our customers that this is what we expect of you. And it's not just all about price, delivery, quality. These are the other things we expect from you. And by the way, we're going to be grading you on these on a regular basis. And that's a very strong motivation for taking action, in my opinion. If your customer's asking for it, you'd be foolish not to listen.
Absolutely.
Walmart had started that years ago where they had a checklist for all their vendors. And if they didn't meet the checklist, they were not going to be considered a vendor. And as a designer, I thought that was brilliant that Walmart was making and taking a stand on it. And I kind of see the trickle effect that's been happening where that same ideology is going to other industries, just like what you're talking about. And again, as designers, we're conscious of it. We're pushing for better materials and better solutions and smaller products, et cetera. And I think it's working. Little by little, I think that it's working.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of our audience questions. Please feel free to drop any more in the chat that you might have. Any closing remarks? Anything you'd like to leave the audience with? One lasting impression? Education.
Education. Yes. Yeah, I think it's a really good thing that we're all doing and talking about. It starts with conversation and then really about getting it implemented and follow through. It's got me very excited to talk to our customers more about their ESG and what they're doing, to really get an understanding for the impact that collectively we can make as designers and manufacturers, retailers, marketing. How do we do a better job at this? I do believe that the youth today is different than it was back in the 60s and 70s, where they're very conscious of the environment and they are looking forward and they are looking at companies that have the same values. And so if you don't change and listen to your customers, you're not going to be around.
Absolutely. And if anyone in the audience wants to partner with Beyond Design on a more sustainable product, where can they find you?
Beyonddesign.com. We're located in Chicago, Illinois.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining our panel. Thank you, Vivek, for joining the panel. Thank you to our entire audience for joining us. We really appreciate you spending the morning with us. We are continuing again tomorrow with Industrial Ethernet Week. We'll be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. U.S. Central Time. And the day 2 topic, simplification and ease of installation in the industrial Ethernet environment. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you tomorrow.